Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the Hoplite channel. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. It's been a minute, so we're back. And if you are here, you have come to see the first episode of COVID-19: The Great Reset by Klaus Schwab. Okay, yeah, we're here finally. I apologize, everyone, if you've been waiting on this one. I actually came down with something about a week ago. I intended to put this video up last Saturday, and I got sick with something pretty nasty. I ran a fever, and I haven't ran a fever since about 2020. So it's a little ironic that the day I go to post this video, I get terribly ill. But anyway, I survived it, right? Like 99.9% of us will. So we're here today. I appreciate you coming by. And we're going to start the first part for our three-part series on COVID-19, the Great Reset. Yeah, and as I said in the previous episodes for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, there's two words in there that you're not allowed to say on YouTube. It's COVID and reset, and we're saying it in one title. So I have no doubt that this video will be suppressed, but if you enjoy it, please share it with family, friends, if you think they'll get something out of it, as I hope they will. But anyway, let's rewind the clock, shall we? And let's do a little timeline discussion before we jump into this book, because I thought it was kind of interesting when I went back and I looked at how things all went down and how we got to the year 2022. So we see that January 20th, the first confirmed case of COVID-19, although back then we were mostly calling it SARS-CoV-2, was identified in the United States, and this was in Washington State. I believe it was a Chinese fellow who had traveled from China to the mainland and was diagnosed in Washington on this date. Coincidentally enough, Dr. Anthony Fauci, lifelong bureaucrat, announces that, the NIH is already working on a vaccine for this. Which I don't remember this, but I looked in the timeline and yeah, it happened. Dr. Fauci, as far back as January 21st of 2020, announced that, we're working on a vaccine for COVID-19, which is interesting because prior to January, it was unknown. Like, it didn't exist as far as the medical world was concerned. We had the first coronavirus, which was SARS-CoV in 2009, I think it was, or 2004, one of those 2 years. Actually, 2009 might have been H1N1. Anyway, this was a brand new virus. It was possibly a variation of the old virus, but to say that we're already working on a vaccine, that should have put up a red flag immediately for everybody who was paying attention. But we really weren't, because even I, back in January 2020, was just watching the news like, all right, well, it's going to be another one of those H1N1 things, and we'll be over it in a month or two. It didn't happen that way. January 23rd, we see the Chinese authorities lock down Wuhan city, and there's 11 million people, give or take, who live in Wuhan. So the Chinese government, bastion of freedom as they are, decide, we'll just lock down 11 million people in their homes. And that's when the madness really started. And I remember seeing that on TV, and it was bizarre. You had people howling in the middle of the night from their balconies in their apartments because the Chinese government had literally boarded up their doors and welded them shut. And that's where it started to look like World War Z. But things got worse. So January 31st, the Trump administration announced a public health emergency for the USA, as in we identified multiple cases in multiple states. And then by March 27th, we see President Trump sign the CARES Act, which officially began the lockdown in the United States, which in hindsight was probably one of the dumbest things any nation has self-imposed, given what we know now. But yeah, the CARES Act, maybe I'll do a video on that, where we basically just printed more money than at any other time in our nation's history combined. Like we just decided to enhance and inflate our currency by 40%, just like that. And it did nothing, by the way. We know that now. But then we see in July of that year, same year, July 16th, Klaus Schwab publishes this book right here we're about to get into, COVID-19, The Great Reset. So between January 20th, right, which would be like the first, I guess, as far as the United States was concerned, the first landfall of COVID on mainland United States, 6.5 months later, our guy writes a book about it. This is the longest of his three. This is over 240 pages. And I looked it up. It's like, how long does it take to normally get a book published? I mean, maybe Klaus has got his own publishing company, right there at the World Economic Forum. But I saw that a book typically takes between 9 months and 2 years to get written and published. And he did it in just over 6 months. What did he know that we didn't know? Or does he just write that fast? And do his helpers proofread that fast? And do they put it into book form and get it on the shelves that fast? Or was this book being written before any of this was going on? Who's to say? But anyway, let's get to the book itself, shall we? And this is part 1, so we're going to start right at the beginning. And we're going to go to the introduction, page 11. Klaus said, "The worldwide crisis triggered by the coronavirus pandemic has no parallel in modern history. We cannot be accused of hyperbole when we say it is plunging our world in its entirety and each of us individually into the most challenging times we've faced in generations. It is our defining moment. We will be dealing with this fallout for years, and many things will change forever. It is bringing economic disruption of monumental proportions, creating a dangerous and volatile period of multiple fronts, politically, socially, geopolitically, raising deep concerns about the environment, and also extending the reach, pernicious or otherwise, of technology into our lives. No industry or business will be spared from the impact of these things. Millions of companies risk disappearing, and many industries face an uncertain future. A few will thrive. On an individual basis, for many, life as they've always known it is unraveling at alarming speed. But deep existential crises also favor introspection and can harbor the potential for transformation. The fault lines of the world, most notably social divides, lack of fairness, absence of cooperation, failure of global governance and leadership, now lie exposed as never before, and people feel the time for reinvention has come. A new world will emerge, the contours of which are for us to both imagine and to draw. At the time of writing, June 2020, the pandemic continues to worsen globally. Many of us are pondering when things will return to normal. The short response is never. Nothing will ever return to the broken sense of normalcy that prevailed prior to the crisis because the coronavirus pandemic marks a fundamental inflection point in our global trajectory. Some analysts call it a major bifurcation. Others refer to a deep crisis of biblical proportion. But the essence remains the same. The world as we knew it in the early months of 2020 is no more, dissolved in the context of the pandemic. Radical changes of such consequence are coming that some pundits have referred to a before corona and after coronavirus era. We will continue to be surprised by both the rapidly and unexpected nature of these changes. As they conflate with each other, they will provoke second, third, fourth, and more order consequences, cascading effects and unforeseen outcomes. In so doing, they will shape a new normal, radically different from the one we will be progressively leaving behind. Many of our beliefs and assumptions about what the world could or should look like will be shattered in the process. Okay, well, that gets us off to a cheery start. That's the first 2 paragraphs of this book. And it's basically telling you to despair. As in, well, you know what? It's June 2020, so 6 months after the pandemic first came to the United States. And, well, the old world's dead. And long live the new world, right? There's going to be radical upheavals, changes that will forever shatter your understanding of world in your life. And don't worry though, there's a lot of opportunity in that. And the new normal is what's going to take shape. And I distinctly remember that phrase being thrown about everywhere in 2020. It's the new normal. And well, the things that we expect aren't going to be the same as they were in 2020 and beyond. A return to normalcy will actually be the new normal. And so what they're telling you is that like we're reshaping your world and your understanding of it. And there will even be a period referred to before coronavirus and after coronavirus, like BC and AD. Like this is like the second age of Christ, but Christ comes in the form of a respiratory virus. It's weird. So he's already setting the tone that like this is going to change your life forever. Despair, but don't worry. Even though it's difficult now, the World Economic Forum is going to lead the way into the future and help usher in what will be the new normal. That's how I read it. Okay, continuing on in the introduction, page 13. Let's begin by putting things into perspective. Human beings have been around for about 200,000 years, the oldest bacteria for billions of years, and viruses for at least 300 million years. This means that most likely pandemics have always existed and have been an integral part of human history since people started traveling around. Over the past 2,000 years, they have been the rule, not the exception. Because of their inherently disruptive nature, epidemics throughout history have proven to be a force for lasting and often radical change, sparking riots, causing population clashes and military defeats, but also triggering innovations, redrawing national boundaries, and often paving the way for revolutions. Outbreaks force empires to change course, like the Byzantine Empire when struck by the plague of Justinian in 541 to 542, and some even to disappear altogether when Aztec and Incan emperors died with the most of their subjects from European germs. Also, authoritative measures to attempt to contain them have always been part of the policy arsenal. Thus, there is nothing new about the confinement and lockdowns imposed upon much of the world to manage COVID-19. They have been common for centuries. The earliest forms of confinement came with the quarantines instituted in an effort to contain the Black Death between 1347 and 1351, killed about a third of Europe. Coming from the word quarantana, which means 40 in Italian, the idea of confining people for 40 days originated without the authorities really understanding what they needed to contain. But the measures were one of the first forms of institutionalized public health that helped legitimize the accretion of power by the modern state. The period of 40 days has no medical foundation. It was chosen for symbolic and religious reasons. Both the Old and New Testaments often refer to number 40 in the context of purification, in particular the 40 days of Lent and 40 days of flood in Genesis. The spread of infectious disease has a unique ability to fuel fear, anxiety, and mass hysteria. In so doing, as we have seen, it also challenges our social cohesion and collective capacity to manage a crisis. Epidemics are by nature divisive and traumatizing. What we are fighting against is invisible. Our family, friends, and neighbors may all become sources of infection. Those everyday rituals we cherish, like meeting a friend in a public place, may become a vehicle for transmission. And the authorities that try to keep us safe by enforcing confinement measures are often perceived as agents of oppression. Really? Well, now that we're 2 years removed from that hysteria, I think it's safe to say that, these agencies and authorities who imposed these draconian lockdowns were just that, agents of oppression. And it's funny he mentions the Black Plague and how a third of Europe died. And he's talking about the quarantine that Europeans forced upon their people was actually a good thing. It's like, we lost a third, but if we hadn't done the quarantine, we would have lost like 2/3. It's like, well, how do we prove a negative, Klaus? Well, we can't, right? So the quarantine, 40 days, because there's biblical significance to day 40, that we just lock people down, was completely based on superstition. Yet he's talking about quarantines as like just the natural order of things because that's what we've always done during pandemics. Turns out that it actually drives people crazy, increases risks of substance abuse, suicide, and people just violate quarantines anyway if they so desire. So there's really nothing you can do to stop an epidemic once it becomes a pandemic. It just has to run its course. And I think they discovered that the people who survived the Black Plague in Europe, the 2/3 who survived, were mostly people who lived out in the country. So they didn't live in densely populated city centers. Despite the fact that in his previous book, he's talking about the Fourth Industrial Revolution creating a world of dense city centers, you would think that, well, if we drive people into these city centers, a pandemic like COVID-19 is simply setting us up for more suffering and death when it does happen, which will be inevitable. We will face another pandemic in the future. That's just the natural cycle of life. But yeah, right now, China is still trying to enforce this ludicrous zero COVID policy. And it turns out the Chinese people are just not having it this time around. And good for them, because now we know that everything that was done 2020 and hence was most likely done simply for the benefit of the state, to see what they could get away with as far as what will you do in exchange for your quote unquote safety. How far will you go, or how much power will you bequeath onto the state and its agents for this perception that one day it'll all be over and we'll all survive. And yeah, it does stoke fear. And that was the whole point. Like, the invisible enemy wasn't necessarily COVID. It was the fear that COVID generated. The idea that this would be a civilization-ending event. And never, since January of 2020 or after, was anyone able to come up with a survivability rate for COVID that was less than like 99%. Yet we decided to change our entire way of life for something that over 99% of people would become infected with and then clear on their own without any medical intervention. It just, looking back now, it's just like, what was it all for? It's like, well, let's read on and find out, because Klaus wrote the book on it. We jump to, this is page 22 under the section Interdependence. Klaus wrote, "The fact that globalization and technological progress have advanced so much over the past few decades has prompted some pundits to declare that the world is now hyper-connected, a variant of interdependence on steroids. What does this interdependence mean in practice? Simply that the world is concatenated, linked together. Just say that. In the early 2010s, Kishore Mahbubani, an academic and former diplomat from Singapore, captured this reality with a boat metaphor. The 7 billion people who inhabit the planet no longer live in more than 100 square separate boats or countries. Instead, they all live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. In his own words, this is one of the greatest transformations ever. In 2020, he pursued his metaphor further in the context of the pandemic by writing, if we 7.5 billion people are now stuck together on a virus-infected cruise ship, does it make sense to clean and scrub only our personal cabins while ignoring the corridors and air wells outside through which the virus travels? The answer is clearly no. Yet this is what we've been doing. Since we are now in the same boat, humanity has to take care of the global boat as a whole. An interdependent world is a world of deep systemic connectivity in which all risks affect each other through a web of complex interactions. In such conditions, the assertion that an economic risk will be confined to the economic sphere, or that an environmental risk won't have repercussions on risks of a different nature, is no longer tenable. We can all think of economic risks turning into political ones, like a sharp rise in unemployment leading to pockets of social unrests, or of technological risks mutating into societal ones, such as the issue of tracing the pandemic on mobile phones, provoking a societal backlash. When considered in isolation, individual risks, whether economic, geopolitical, social, or environmental in character, give the false impression that they can be contained or mitigated. In real life, systemic connectivity shows this to be an artificial construct. In an interdependent world, risks amplify each other and in so doing have cascading effects. That is why isolation or containment cannot rhyme with interdependence and interconnectedness. Okay, so in the previous section, I thought he just got done telling us that quarantining back, centuries ago made sense, and it makes sense today. As in lockdowns, are just something we have to do. But now he's saying, there's a interdependence. Interdependence. It's just so silly. There's more of this communist talk, right? It's like, this is the new normal. We're all in this together. We're all interdependent. And, we're not just 173 or 193 separate boats. We're 193 cabins living on the same boat, on a cruise ship. Which is a stupid analogy, right? Because we literally have oceans separating us. So how are we on the same boat, but separated by oceans and continents? If we don't let people from country A come into country B, then we avoid any risk of contagion from that country. That kind of quarantining makes sense. But once it's endemic in your particular country, locking down your country is simply delaying the inevitable and most likely is going to harm you economically. And he mentions that, which I thought was ironic, when he says we risk these economic problems turning into political ones, like a sharp rise in unemployment leading to pockets of social unrest. Yeah, what happened in the summer of 2020? He wrote this in June. This was published in June and July. We saw the George Floyd riots in the United States leading up to the 2020 election. I'm sure all that was a coincidence too, right? Here you had the worst pandemic in modern history. We were told that allegedly. But at the same time, you had police forces that were being told to let people just vent their anger out in public in mobs of hundreds of, if not thousands. And this was all going on at the height of the lockdown, right? March was the lockdown in the United States, but by May, June, and July, there were mass gatherings and riots being held on every major corner in every major city. And where was all the pandemic doom and gloom talk then? It was not like, these people got to be broken up and arrested and separated because it's just going to spread, coronavirus that much faster. That never came up, right? The social upheaval was a more important story than the pandemic. And then once all that died down and the mob got what they wanted, we went back to the pandemic talk being the most important and dangerous thing. And all of these risks, at least he's right in this sense, all of these risks are connected. Like if you have a pandemic and that's a social risk, as in if we don't take measures to protect people who are most vulnerable to it, then those people will become burdens on the economic system. And then those economic problems will cascade to other people, and those problems can become law enforcement problems, etc. So yeah, like one of these dominoes can knock over the whole row, but here he's saying we're so interdependent we can't just quarantine our way out of it. So I'm kind of confused here as to what he thought like the solution would be. Let's continue. This is on page 27 under velocity. We can see velocity everywhere, whether it's a crisis, social discontent, technological developments and adoption, geopolitical upheaval, the financial markets, and of course the manifestation of infectious diseases. Everything now runs on fast forward. As a result, we operate in real-time society with the nagging feeling that the pace of life is ever increasing. This new culture of immediacy, obsessed with speed, is apparent in all aspects of our lives, from just-in-time supply chains to high-frequency trading, from speed dating to fast food. It is so pervasive that some pundits call this new phenomenon the dictatorship of urgency. It can indeed take extreme forms. Research performed by scientists at Microsoft shows, for example, that being slower by no more than 250 milliseconds, or a quarter of a second, is enough for a website to lose hits to its faster competitors. The all-embracing result is the shelf life of a policy, a product or an idea, and the life cycle of a decision maker or a project are contracting sharply and often unpredictably. Nothing illustrates this more vividly than the breakneck speed with which COVID progressed in March 2020. In less than a month, from the maelstrom provoked by the staggering speed at which the pandemic engulfed most of the world, a whole new era seemed to emerge. The beginning of the outbreak was thought to have taken place in China sometime earlier, but the exponential global progression of the pandemic took many decision makers and a majority of the public by surprise, because we generally find it cognitively hard to grasp the significance of exponential growth. Consider the following in terms of days for doubling. If a pandemic grows at 30% a day, as COVID-19 did around mid-March, registered cases or deaths will double in a little more than 2 days. If it grows at 20%, it will take between 4 and 5 days. And if it grows at 10%, it will take just more than a week. Expressed differently, at the global level, it took COVID-19 3 months to reach 100,000 cases, 12 days to double to 200,000, 4 days to reach 300,000, and then 400,000 and 500,000 cases were reached in 2 days each. These numbers make our heads spin. Extreme velocity in action. Exponential growth is so baffling to our cognitive functions that we often deal with it by developing exponential myopia, thinking of it as nothing more than very fast. In a famous experiment conducted in 1975, 2 psychologists found that when we have to predict an exponential process, we often underestimate by a factor of 10. Understanding this growth dynamic and the power of exponentials clarifies why velocity is such an issue and why the speed of invention to curb the rate of growth is so crucial. Ernest Hemingway understood this. In his novel, The Sun Also Rises, 2 characters have the following conversation. "How did you go bankrupt?" Bill asked. "2 ways," Mike said. "Gradually, then suddenly." The same tends to happen for big systemic shifts and disruption in general. Things tend to change gradually at first, then all at once. Expect the same for the macro reset. Okay, so what he's saying is that COVID has changed our understanding of how fast the world moves and this concept of exponential growth. As in, once something reaches 10%, it will then double each day. So you will go from 10 to 20 to 40 to 80 to 160 and so on. And this exponential growth will seem to come out of nowhere because we can't wrap our heads around something enlarging from size X to size Y to Z in a span of a week when it was simply this small at its beginning stage. He's saying that the macro reset, which he's telling you in no uncertain terms is coming, will be no different. It will move exponentially and people will fail to comprehend how big it is until it literally encompasses our entire way of life. It's this velocity of growth. And this is the crux of, I think, him trying to create the connection between COVID-19 and the World Economic Forum's idea of the Great Reset. They wanted this pandemic to be a trigger for the Great Reset. It looks like that's kind of stalled because people have essentially just washed their hands of COVID and they're done with it. They know it's out there. They've gotten it already. Most people have gotten it twice. Some people have gotten it 3 or 4 times, and they're just going to learn to live with it. So it doesn't look like COVID-19 is going to usher in the Great Reset, but it's laying the foundations, the rails for the Great Reset when it does come, and this idea of exponential growth being first introduced to the public at large by a pandemic, by a virus that can move that fast and take over the world in less than a year. Okay, moving on. Jump to page 33. This is still under the macro reset. Klaus wrote, "A pandemic is a complex adaptive system comprising many different components or pieces of information, as diverse as biology or psychology, whose behavior is influenced by such variables as the role of companies, economic policies, government intervention, healthcare politics, or national governance. For this reason, it can and should be viewed as a living network. that adapts to changing conditions, not something set in stone, but a system of interactions that's both complex and adaptive. It is complex because it represents a cat's cradle of interdependence and interconnections from which it stems, and adaptive in the sense that its behavior is driven by interactions between nodes, organizations, and people, us, that can become confused and unruly in times of stress. Will we adjust to the norms of confinement? Will the majority of us abide by the rules? The management, containment, of a complex adaptive system requires continuous real-time but ever-changing collaboration between a vast array of disciplines and between different fields within these disciplines. Just to provide a broad and oversimplified example, the containment of the coronavirus pandemic will necessitate a global surveillance network capable of identifying new outbreaks as soon as they arise, laboratories in multiple locations around the world that can rapidly analyze new viral strains and develop effective treatments, large IT infrastructures so that the communities can prepare and react effectively, appropriate and coordinated policy mechanisms to efficiently implement the decisions once they are made, and so on. The important point is this: each separate activity by itself is necessary to address the pandemic, but is insufficient if not considered in conjunction with the others. It follows that this complex adaptive system is greater than the sum of its parts. Its effectiveness depends on how well it works as a whole and is only strong as its weakest link. Okay, so what is he saying here? Well, this is like the Fourth Industrial Revolution with a pandemic theme, right? It's everything's interconnected and everything's interdependent. And you have layers, within systems, within levels, within networks, which are comprised of nodes. Everything is what he's saying is there's no way for you to separate yourself from what the world has to do to combat this. We're going to have to set up systems that can identify new viruses. We're going to have laboratories all over the place to identify treatments for them. And we're going to have distribution centers to make sure people get treatments. So he's more or less talking about COVID-19 and already thinking about the next pandemic and what it's going to mean for the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset. And the long and short of it is the entire world is going to have to cooperate together so that we can better address it. You will not be able to address a pandemic as a country or even a continent. You will have to address the pandemic as a part of the global whole. And we're only as strong as our weakest link. Again, if you shed all of this fluff and crap that Klaus talks about with this fancy language, he's talking about communism. But he's not just talking about communism as it pertains to a particular set of people. He's talking about communism via technology as it pertains to the world. And that there will be one way of doing things because we will be so interconnected that where one goes, we all go. And that's what he's getting at. And I hope you're picking up on these themes in all of these books that we're covering, because that's the same consistent theme is no man will be an island. And that's going to change your idea of what normal is, but it will benefit mankind as a whole because we're all going to do it together, whether you like it or not. Okay, moving on. Page 36. This is under Economic Reset, the economics of COVID-19. Klaus wrote, measured against the landscape of just a few decades ago, let alone centuries ago, today's economy is simply unrecognizable. Notwithstanding some of the economic lessons to be gleaned from historical pandemics are still valid today to help grasp what lies ahead. The global economic catastrophe we are now confronting is the deepest recorded since 1945. In terms of sheer speed, it is unparalleled in history. Although it does not rival the calamities and absolute economic desperation that societies endured in the past, there are some telling characteristics that are hauntingly similar. When in 1665, over the space of 18 months, the last bubonic plague had eradicated a quarter of London's population. Daniel Defoe wrote in a journal of the plague of the year, all trades being stopped, employment ceased, the labor, and by that the bread of the poor were cut off. And at first, indeed, the cries of the poor were most lamentable to hear. Thousands of them have stayed in London till nothing but desperation sent them away. Death overtook them on the road, and they served for no better than the messengers of death. Defoe's book is full of anecdotes that resonate with today's situation, telling us how the rich were escaping to the country, taking death with them, and observing how the poor were much more exposed to the outbreak, or describing how quacks and mountebanks sold false cures. Interesting he brings that up. Quacks and mountebanks sold false cures. Here, I'll point you back again. Dr. Fauci announced on the same week, the same day practically, that the first COVID case that made landfall and was identified in the United States, that the NIH was working on a vaccine. And what did we find out 2 years later? None of the vaccines were ever tested as far as efficacy to stop transmission of COVID-19. Well, what the hell were they made for then? They were made because somebody said we need one of these. Because again, I told you in this, well, not even 20 minutes ago, that the invisible enemy that was COVID-19 was actually the fear of COVID-19, and it wasn't the virus itself. It was the fear that what was going on was possibly going to be a civilization-ending event, and people were willing to do everything and anything to avoid having to face that reality. Like maybe allowing a quack or a mountebank to sell them a false cure. And that's what happened. And now more evidence is coming out that these pharmaceutical companies knew they were selling you something that was not going to provide what it was advertised to do. Basically false advertising, and in some cases, people suffered injury or death on account of it because, as we know, I believe May 2023 will be the conclusion of phase 1 for the safety and efficacy trials of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. Phase 1. There are 2 more phases to go. But it's not going to matter because everybody who they wanted to take the vaccine already did. I won't get into what that holds for the future, but I foresee in the future so many health complications arising because of what started in January 2020 that it will be hard to imagine. And most people will just block it out. They will not want to accept that because what we did in our haste, because of the velocity of change, what we did out of that haste created possibly decades of pain and suffering that are yet to come. But the data will bear that out. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think that's what's going to happen. And it's crazy that so many people surrendered themselves to that just irrationality because the invisible enemy of fear was all they could think about. And it's a shame. Let's continue on. This is page 39 under uncertainty. Ironic. Klaus wrote, the high degree of ongoing uncertainty surrounding COVID-19 makes it incredibly difficult to precisely assess the risk it poses. No kidding. As with all new risks that are agents of fear, this creates a lot of social anxiety that impacts economic behavior. An overwhelming consensus had emerged within the global scientific community that Jin Qi, one of China's leading scientists, had it right when he said in April 2020, this is very likely to be an epidemic that coexists with humans for a long time, becomes seasonal, and is sustained within human bodies. Okay, this Chinese scientist, Jin Qi, April 2020, so a couple months after this, said, yeah, this is going to coexist with us for a long time, and it's going to become seasonal and is sustained within human bodies. What does that sound like to you? What's seasonal, something we coexist with, and is sustained within our bodies? The flu. The common cold. Take your pick. All of those things reoccur around the same time. Right? I just told you that I had to postpone posting this video because I got sick last week. Was it COVID? Maybe. Or was it just a really bad flu? Possibly. How would I know the difference? Was it a COVID test? No, why would I bother with that? I'm still here after 2 years, and there's no way with all the people I've interacted with, all the places I've gone, that I haven't gotten COVID yet. But it's just something that, like this scientist said, we're just going to learn to live with, and it's going to be sustained within our bodies. It's going to be something that coexists with mankind. But we didn't let it. We didn't let it do that. We thought that if we did A, B, and C, we could avoid all of those things from happening. And it turns out we just gave ourselves a longer road to hoe and more pain and suffering. That's all it got us. Continuing, page 40. Ever since the pandemic started, we have been bombarded daily with the relentless stream of data. But in June 2020, roughly half a year after the beginning of the outbreak, our knowledge is still very patchy as a result, and we still don't really know how dangerous COVID-19 is. Despite the deluge of scientific papers published on coronavirus, its infection fatality rate around 0.4 to 0.5%, possibly up to 1%. The ratio of undetected or confirmed cases, the rate of transmissions from asymptomatic individuals, the seasonality effect, the length of the incubation period, the national infection rates, progress in terms of understanding each of these is being made, but they and many other elements remain unknown or known unknowns to a large extent. For policymakers and public officials, this prevailing level of uncertainty makes it very difficult to devise the right public health strategy and the concomitant economic strategy. This should not come as a surprise. Ann Rimmon, a professor of epidemiology at UCLA, confesses, "This is a novel virus, new to humanity, and nobody knows what will happen. Such circumstances require a good dose of humility because, in the words of Peter Piot, one of the world's leading virologists, the more we learn about coronavirus, the more questions arise. COVID-19 is a master disguise that manifests itself with protein symptoms that are confounding the medical community. It is first and foremost a respiratory disease, but for a small but sizable number of patients, symptoms range from cardiac inflammation and digestive problems to kidney infection, blood clots, and meningitis. In addition, many people who recover are left with chronic kidney and heart problems, as well as lasting neurological effects." And that's funny because it's 2020, this is written in 2020, but in 2022, we still don't really know the definite origins of COVID-19. More and more data is showing, though, that it was actually a chimera virus and was most likely made in the lab by splicing different strains of viruses together as it was engineered. And it just so happens that the Frankenstein monster got out. Fortunately for mankind, it has been roughly 0.4 to 1% lethal. So 99, like I said, over 99% of people infected with it will survive it without any long-lasting effects. That's not great for the unlucky, 0.5%, but for the vast, vast, vast majority of us, it's just going to be another virus that we have to deal with, right? So why did we jump the gun and go through all of these draconian measures for something we didn't even understand yet? Again, it was the uncertainty, it was the fear. And governments seized upon that. Governments thrive off of a population that is captured by fear, because they will look to anyone who has the means or even proposes they have the means to make it all go away for safety and for comfort. And they will just give up everything if it means that the person coming with the solution, even if that solution's false, gives them that nice warm and fuzzy feeling that it's all going to be okay. We're all in this together. We got to learn to live with the new normal. We're all in this because it's brand new to everybody. But if you trust us, we'll figure a way out of it. Trust the science, trust the experts. And it's when those people come to you that early in a situation where nobody has any reason to know what's going on, that you should doubt and suspect those motives of those people. Because how would you know what to do? We've never been here before. You're so certain, and you claim to have, the roadmap of how to get out of here, but why would I surrender all of my rights and all of my privileges to you? Because what reason do I have to believe that you know any better than I do? And they don't. And we found that out in 2 years. They really didn't. But here we are. Moving on, page 42. Under the section, the economic fallacy of sacrificing a few lives to save growth. Klaus wrote, throughout the pandemic, there has been a perennial debate about saving lives versus saving the economy. Lives versus livelihoods. This is a false trade-off. From an economic standpoint, the myth of having to choose between public health and a hit to GDP growth can be easily debunked. Leaving aside the ethical issue of whether sacrificing some lives to save the economy is a social Darwinian proposition, deciding not to save lives will not improve economic welfare. The reasons are twofold. On the supply side, if prematurely loosening the various restrictions and the rules of social distancing result in an acceleration of infection, more employees and workers would become infected and more businesses would stop functioning. After the onset of the pandemic in 2020, the validity of this argument was proven on several occasions. They ranged from factories that had to stop operating because too many workers had fallen ill. Primarily the case for work environments that forced physical proximity between workers, like in meat processing facilities. Naval ships stranded because too many crew members had been infected, thus preventing the vessel from operating normally. An additional factor that negatively affects the supply of labor is that around the world there were repeated instances of workers refusing to return to work for fear of becoming infected. In many large companies, employees who felt vulnerable to the disease generated a wave of activism, including work stoppages. On the demand side, the argument boils down to the most basic and yet fundamental determinant of economic activity, sentiments. Because consumer sentiments are what really drive economies, a return to any kind of normal will only happen when and not before confidence returns. Individual perceptions of safety drive consumer and business decisions, which means that sustained economic improvement is contingent upon two things: the confidence that the pandemic is behind us, without which people will not consume and invest, and the proof that the virus is defeated globally, without which people will not be able to feel safe, first locally and subsequently further afield. Okay, let's stop there for a second because we found out later both of those points are bogus. The majority of people chose not to go to work because A, they're lazy and just wanted a reason out of work, which those people exist no matter what's going on. And number two, they didn't want to go to work out of fear that they would get sick and possibly die. If you had left going to work and earning a livelihood up to the people themselves, the majority of the people who work and have to put food on the table for a living would have chosen to go to work. And we saw that all through during the lockdown. You had cops who were writing tickets and shutting down businesses left and right who refused to comply with the lockdowns versus actually going after regular criminals. The business of the state became shutting down businesses that sustained the state. So we had to print money. We had to inflate our currency, and that was the only way out. Cops are going to go out and shut down businesses. Well, who's going to pay taxes and keep the lights on? We'll just print money. That was the solution during a pandemic where the majority of people would get sick and recover within a week, and they still were told they couldn't go out. They still were told they couldn't spend money or make money. And Schwab is saying, well, you can't boil it down between lives and GDP. That's not a fair comparison. It's like, no, it is, because by shutting down the economy, you weren't slowing down the pandemic itself. We know that. And secondly, you were just harming people economically. So while the pandemic was raging, people were learning how to do more with less. And that was unnecessary. Continuing. Page 44. The logical conclusion of these 2 points is this: governments must do whatever it takes and spend whatever it costs in the interests of our health and our collective wealth for the economy to recover sustainability. As both an economist and public health specialist put it, only saving lives will save livelihoods, making it clear that only policy measures that place people's health at their core will enable an economic recovery, adding, if government fails to save lives, people afraid the virus will not resume shopping, traveling, or dining out. This will hinder economic recovery, lockdown or no lockdown. Again, not true. We found out that after several months of this, people were already over it. I want to say by spring break of even in spring break of 2020, people were going out and just partying on the beach in Florida. People were already over it that early. They were already ready to go back to living life and spending money and making money. This idea that, well, if we can't save lives, we can't save livelihoods. No, you can't do both. If you're going to crush someone's livelihood, that might cost them their life anyway. Continuing. Only future data and subsequent analysis will provide incontrovertible proof that the trade-off between health and economy does not exist, which we found out. That said, some U.S. data collected in the early phases of reopening in some states showed a drop in spending and working even before lockdown. Once people began to worry about the pandemic, they effectively started to shut down the economy, even before governments had officially asked them to. A similar phenomenon took place after some American states decided to partially reopen. Consumption remained subdued. This proves the point that economic life cannot be activated by fiat, but it also illustrates the predicament that most decision makers experience when having to decide whether to reopen or not. The economic and societal damage of lockdown is glaringly obvious to everybody, while success in terms of containing the outbreak and preventing deaths, a prerequisite for a successful opening, is more or less invisible. There is no public celebration when a coronavirus case or death doesn't happen, leading to the public health policy paradox that when you do it right, nothing happens. This is why delaying the lockdown or opening too early was always such a strong policy temptation. However, several studies have shown how such a temptation carried considerable risk. Two in particular, coming to similar conclusions with different methodologies, modeled what could have happened without lockdown. According to one conducted by the Imperial College of London, wide-scale, rigorous lockdowns imposed in March 2020 averted 3.1 million deaths in 11 European countries. The other, led by the University of California, Berkeley, concluded that 530 million total infections corresponding to 62 million confirmed cases were averted in 6 countries by the confinement measures that each had put into place. The simple conclusion is, in countries afflicted with registered COVID-19 cases at the peak were roughly doubling every 2 days, government had no reasonable alternative but to impose rigorous lockdowns. Okay, both of those studies we now know are complete and utter BS. They're crap. You cannot look at lockdowns across the span of these countries, including the United States, and say, oh, by doing X, Y, and Z, we stopped 530 million cases worldwide, which would mean 62 million, hospitalizations and X amount of deaths. That's complete nonsense. And back then, who knows what they were basing those figures off of? What we know now is, number one, the pandemic was inevitable after a certain point. Most likely, once the confirmed case hit the United States and other countries had their confirmed cases, you were not stopping it. By locking down, all you were doing was dragging out the first wave of the pandemic. Everybody who was going to get it eventually. The people would have reached herd immunity much faster if healthy people were allowed to go out, interact, keep the economy open, get sick and recover and be over it, right? But instead, we harmed our economy and we put off the inevitable point where everybody was going to get coronavirus anyway. And everyone says, oh, it would have overwhelmed the hospital systems. And the fact of the matter is, that's not true. If 99% of people who got infected with COVID would get over it without long-lasting effects and without requiring medical attention, that fact alone means it would never have overwhelmed the hospitals. The hospitals you saw that were overwhelmed in Italy, those were all senior citizens, right? And the problem is, we didn't take measures to protect the vulnerable people. We said we were going to, but we didn't. We simply made those people abide by the same rules as healthy people. But the problem is, those elderly people need regular care and maintenance from younger people. So they're going to have to interact with those people. By not quarantining the most vulnerable class, we put those people at significant risk, and that's why you saw those people overwhelming hospitals. I only know of 1 or 2 people who actually had to be treated for COVID-19. The overwhelming majority of people I know, and again, this is anecdotal, that got COVID, 10 days, 2 weeks max was how long they were sick. Some people were really sick and had to take off work for the whole 2 weeks. Other people lost their sense of smell for 3 or 4 days, and that was it. I, for example, just had a bad fever. So we really pulled a knee-jerk reaction to COVID-19, and we only did ourselves a disservice by prolonging herd immunity. And that much is clear now. We know that now. This was not Spanish flu. This was not the bubonic plague. This was something we turned into those plagues as far as the seriousness, but the threat was never there. And I think we knew that probably by July, that this threat never really manifested itself. But that did not stop governments from doing what they did. Last passage. We jump to page 48. Klaus wrote, several months in the pandemic, it looks like even a semblance of a return to business as usual for most service companies is inconceivable as long as COVID-19 remains a threat to our health. This in turn suggests that a full return to normal cannot be envisioned before a vaccine is available. When might that be? According to most experts, it's unlikely to be before the first quarter of 2021 at the earliest. In mid-June 2020, already more than 135 trials are underway, proceeding at a remarkable pace considering that in the past it could take up to 10 years to develop a vaccine, 5 years in the case of Ebola. So the reason is not science, but production. Manufacturing billions of doses constitutes the real challenge that will require massive expansion and diversion of existing capacity. The next hurdle is the political challenge of vaccinating enough people worldwide with a high enough compliance rate despite the rise of anti-vaxxers. During the intervening months, the economy will not operate at full capacity, a country-dependent phenomenon dubbed the 80% economy. Companies in sectors as varied as travel, hospitality, retail, or sports and events will face the following triple whammy. Fewer customers, those who consume will spend less on average, and transaction costs will be higher. Taking into account the criticality of services for GDP growth, the richer the country, the greater importance of services for growth, this new reality of an 80% economy begs the question of whether successive possible shutdowns of business activity in the service sector will have lasting effects on the broader economy through bankruptcies and losses of employment, which in turn begs the question of whether these possible lasting effects could be followed by a collapse in demand as people lose their income and their confidence in the future. Such a scenario will almost inevitably lead to a collapse in investment among businesses and a surge in precautionary saving among consumers, with fallout in the entire global economy through capital flight, the rapid and uncertain movement of large amounts of money out of a country, which tends to exacerbate economic crises. Okay, he's almost trying to shove your face in it. It's like he's predicting what exactly is going to happen on account of these COVID-19 lockdowns. And he's already talking about a vaccine, the rise of anti-vaxxers. Yeah, it turns out all of the anti-vaxxers were 100% right. And they were a distinct minority. And that's usually how it works, right? There is that small, stalwart, stubborn, pain in the ass minority that does not trust authority when it comes offering a cure and a solution out of nowhere without any data to back it up. The anti-vaxxers were 100% right. You were better off getting sick with COVID, going through that crap, and then coming out the other end with your own natural immunity, with your own antibodies, than letting somebody shoot you up with an experimental shot and then later admitting, oh, it was never really tested for transmission and it actually was never really tested to mitigate symptoms. We had to move at the speed of science. Remember that? That great quote? That quote's going to go down in history. We had to move at the speed of science. And like I said, none of these vaccines ever cleared FDA clinical trial phase 1. They're all still in phase 1 of clinical trials, I believe. I know the Pfizer one is. But everybody took it anyway. And they're just left to deal with the fallout from that. And there's another famous, I can't remember who said it, but he said, vaccines are a very important part of medical science. Vaccines have led to breakthroughs and have saved millions of lives. But the problem is this with a vaccine. I can vaccinate you, I can't unvaccinate you, which means once that shot goes into your arm and whatever's in that vial goes into your system, it's there and it's going to do what it does. There's no antidote vaccine to reverse it. Once it's in you, for good or evil. And we rushed to get that done. Because like I said, the fear is what drove people. The fear is what led people to agree to shut down their businesses. And I don't even know what the numbers are now, but the amount of people who had to declare bankruptcy, the amount of businesses that went under, like think about restaurants or bars or hotels or mom and pop grocery stores, like the places that required people to show up and use their services or buy their goods, that completely went under because of this fear. That was totally unfounded now that we know better. And this is the whole point of the Great Reset, right? And that's the more important part of this book's title, is the Great Reset. It is to get you to get ready for a total reimagining of life. And it's going to come through the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and it's going to come in the form of pandemics. And they're already setting us up to get ready for the next pandemic. And they've already taken the temperature and put their finger in the air to see which way the wind blows as to what governments can get away with when they impose these measures on people as a whole. What will people put up with? How far are they willing to let countries and politicians and police forces go? And that's the more important point, is humanity survived the bubonic plague and the Justinian plague. I think they found out that the Justinian plague was actually the bubonic plague part 1. But I don't think people back then stopped producing grain, stopped serving wine, stopped going to gladiators. I mean, people still carried on with regular everyday life because that is the human condition. You're going to get sick, you're going to get hurt, and one day you're going to die. And we need to accept this as just part of life. And the more we fight against that natural process unreasonably, the more we potentially exacerbate the suffering that will go along with it. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't develop vaccines, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't study new ways to deal with pandemics, but they should occur with the scientific method behind them. And we should have years of data to see, well, this one works, this one doesn't. This one definitely doesn't work, this one has potential to work, and you keep testing them. We didn't do that in 2020. We just threw ourselves face first into this problem and said, well, if even half of this solution is effective, I'm willing to give up my livelihood, I'm willing to give up my possible health and safety for a chance at it. And it's just the chance that makes you want to give that up. But you don't step back and realize that, hey, maybe I have 40 years of my life or 30 years of my life left to live, and the things I do now and the things I give up, will I ever get them back? And I think in hindsight now in 2022, reading this book, we should all realize that no, the things that you give up are far more important than any promise that what you're going through in these few months can be avoided. And that's just where we are. Okay. I'm throwing out a lot of opinions, I know. And this was a long one, so I apologize for ranting and raving there for a bit. But this one bothers me personally, because I remember where I was when COVID was first officially announced on the news, and I remember those weeks and those months that came after, and I'm thinking to myself, this just all seems like a panic and a rush. Are we going to pay for this down the road? And I think we did. And I started the channel, the Hoplite channel, because, and I want to do an episode of why I call it the Hoplite channel, is because Hoplites are citizen soldiers. You're responsible for yourself. Your community is going to rely upon you to know the difference between right and wrong, to recognize bullcrap when you see it, and to prepare yourself for war or for pandemic on your own, and to do the responsible thing and to ally yourself with people who think the same and say, hey, it's up to us on an individual level. This COVID-19 Great Reset grand design that we're all going to have this global solution to these problems because everything's interconnected, it's not. It starts at the individual level. And to be a hoplite is to be a citizen soldier. You're responsible for your defense, for your country's defense, and for your own well-being. We're not in this together. But if we all take individual responsibility and we find other people who are doing that for themselves, those are the people you can ally yourself with, because if they can rely on themselves for their own safety, maybe they can be of use in the future if you ever need help. But if they see that same understanding in your eyes, then we can proceed into the future as a nation of responsible individuals who rely on that collective and not this collective that everybody else will look after everybody else. Everybody is going to look after themselves first. So do that correctly, first and foremost, and then we can talk about maybe doing things as a collective. But jumping to the collective off the bat is destined for failure, because half are going to look to live off the other half. And that's just human nature too. And it's kind of a downer, but that's the way life goes, right? Half of the people, if given the choice, will choose to live off the other half, at least. And we don't want that, because eventually the half that is doing all the work will lose hope and give up. And then it all collapses. And that's what we want to avoid. Okay, I appreciate everybody tuning in today. I'm still getting over whatever I was sick with a week ago, so I apologize for my voice, or if my thoughts are kind of foggy out there. I'm trying to keep it together. But thanks for watching this. As I said, share it with your family or friends if you think they would get something out of it. And we will pick up with part 2 of COVID-19 and the Great Reset by Klaus Schwab right here next time. Till then, take it easy.